Hi, this is Professor JPS, and this is Communication Arts 257, American Film Heritage, the class in 1960s/70s films. This is March 30th, 2020, and this is part two, MASH/Godfather. In part one, I discussed the film MASH from last week and reminded you some aspects of the readings I think will be very important for you. This week's film is a very well-known film, a landmark film in the early 1970s, and it was a really a huge film in terms of its ability to both become a critical success and also an economic success. As I mentioned in the first part of this particular course, that in the early to mid 1960s, the Hollywood film community was not on sound financial footing. After generations of making a great deal of money, the film industry had lost out a little to television and also to some constitutional rules that broke up their vertically integrated studio system, and that the movies had sort of meandered along, a little bit of a hit here, a little bit of a miss there, and there was no real foothold on making a success in Hollywood in the early to mid 60s. And in fact, this entire course is a course in the filmmakers of that era who ultimately did get people back into the movie theaters and were relatively young filmmakers. And the relatively young filmmakers were, for the first time in Hollywood's history, were given a chance to make their own kinds of films. And the films were critically interesting and also bespoke of the particular era of anti-authority, anti-establishment. And today's filmmaker is Francis Ford Coppola, and he had been successful in working in films in Hollywood prior to taking on this challenge of making this film, The Godfather, in 1972. He had written a screenplay for the film Patton and had won an Oscar for it in 1970. And he was a pretty bright fellow who went to film school at the University of UCLA in California. The film The Godfather is based upon a novel by a man called Mario Puzo, P-U-Z-O. And it's a fairly lengthy novel, and it's a novel that was a bestseller in the middle latter 60s, I think. Now, this is a rare example where the novel is not as good as the movie. Usually the novel is much better than the movie because the novel is something to be written and read and work in your imagination. That's why good novels are good novels. The Godfather, the novel, in my estimation, is not really that great of a novel. I mean, it's not a bad story, but it's written in a very pulpy language. It meanders off into very strange segments that aren't that interesting. But the screenplay to The Godfather, written both by Coppola and Puzo, is much better in terms of the immediacy of the moment. By that I mean, this film is made and produced in 1972, and it's the same year that the Nixon administration got into trouble with something called Watergate. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But when this movie, and it's a long movie, it's about 3 hours long, when this movie made its way into the American mainstream, it was supremely successful. And part of the reason, again, for all the films we're seeing, was because this particular film has a kind of interesting idea about power and authority. And it's showing that power and authority as easily corruptible, easily hypocritical. Because at the crux of this film, both the book and the film, but particularly the film, is that what Coppola is doing is he's equating the Corleone family with the United States government and its foreign policies. He's equating the Corleone family with American capitalism and its cutthroat practices. He's equating the Corleone family with institutions of American power that are so easily bribed and corrupted, like judges, like lawyers, like policemen. What Coppola is saying is that the mafia had become so powerful by the post-World War II period that they were in business with just about everybody else. And when the movie is made in 1972, it resonates quite a bit with audiences because that's the same year that the Nixon administration got caught in Watergate. Now, Nixon didn't resign. He was almost impeached. He didn't resign until 2 years later. But that idea that power is easily corrupted, absolute power is absolutely corrupt. That's the old saying, right? And this film is trying to equate American business, American government, American institutions as corrupted by mafia power. It's not just about gangland power. It's not just about, holding on to turf and killing this one guy and killing that other guy. It's about bribing judges. It's about bribing congressmen. It's about bribing the excuse me. It's about bribing the institutions of American power and making that plain in the story. And audiences, again, of the 1960s and 70s were really, really happy to see that because it was fresh, it was original, it was mature, it was adult themed. It was not exaggerated and silly and over the top, okay? And it was quiet. The film was relatively quiet with spasms of violence, okay? Just a couple of things before we just get into The Godfather in terms of what I think you should look for and what I think is powerful about the film. Again, back to the readings that I have for you. This is the Godfather reading that I've given out to everyone, and you may see my chicken scratch handwriting down here. This gives a little bit of the history of the gangster film or the criminal film in America in the 20th century. Don't freak out. You're not going to need to know exactly all of these folks, exactly all of these films and filmmakers. I just want to give you a general sense of what happened with The Godfather and how The Godfather worked to be different generically than these other films. You see, gangster films have always been popular with audiences because they give you a kind of vicarious thrill to see what it's like to live outside the law, right? I mean, we still go to see movies where there's gangsters who are the main characters. Now, when a movie is really compelling, it shows you the rationale for the gangsters doing this, not just some murderous freak who's trying to kill people and take sexy women and snort cocaine like crazy. I mean, that's kind of cartoonish. In The Godfather, there's a high degree of sympathy for the Corleone family because they're a literal family, right? With all of these brothers and this patriarch who's kind of the king, if you like, the Marlon Brando character, Don Vito Corleone family, they're this institution of corruption and power. They have actual real power, okay? And that kind of dual idea of family is important. But in gangster films made many, many years ago in the 20s and 30s, it was usually about immigration. It was usually about an Irish guy or an Italian guy or a Jewish guy who rose to power being very, very vindictive. And then once he was gotten rid of, then everything went back to normal. And the context of those films made in the 20s and 30s was beware of the immigrant. They're not real Americans, okay? Whether it was Jimmy Cagney or Paul Muni or Edward G. Robinson. Again, don't freak out about that. I just want to give you a little bit of history. You don't have to know all these films. But there's always text and there's context, right? And the context of films of that era were that you have all these immigrants who are screwing up the country. That was essentially the minor message of those films. Gangster or crime films after World War II were much more psychological, and there was a whole subgenre called film noir. And those films are very contemplative, very interesting films about men, primarily men, who are kind of psychologically screwed up after the war. And there's a good deal of sexual tension in those films with a character called the femme fatale, which is a female who's exhibiting her sexual prowess over people. We'll talk more about this when we get to the film Chinatown. But those films of the 40s, the film noir films are very dark, obviously, because film noir means black film. And when I say black, I don't mean race. I don't mean African Americans. I mean literally dark film. And the themes of those films are very, very dark. Now, that's also in the reading, okay? So that's just part of the history of the gangster film that I'm trying to get at. The '60s gangster film you should know, because the best example of it is Bonnie and Clyde, as they are sort of turned into revolutionary heroes befitting the 1960s sensibilities of anti-authority, anti-establishment ideas. I mean, Bonnie and Clyde are actually killed in slow motion as if they're being deified, like godlike, sustaining their lives for the idea that they were trying, in some ways, to be different. Um, audiences responded. Audiences responded in the 1960s to that. The Godfather, as I point out here, it's a little bit different. Remember, it's made from a book, but it's trying to be immediate for the early '70s. Even though the film takes place between about 1945 and about 1960, or maybe even less than that. I'm thinking of Godfather 2 as well. The film takes place in the latter '40s, early '50s, but it's really speaking with the '60s heart. It's really speaking with the '60s sensibility, calling out all the hypocrisy, calling out all of the bribery, calling out the idea that the institutions of American life are not necessarily incorruptible. They're easily corruptible. Okay. And I point out here, The Godfather relies on our understanding that criminal activity is everywhere and depends upon the corruption of political figures. The things we take for granted in earlier gangster films, that government is good and not corrupt, judges, police, congressmen, is overturned in The Godfather. Organized crime is just that, very organized and institutionalized. And this speaks to the Watergate era in which the film was made. In other words, The Godfather represents how capitalism works. The mob is as corrupt as major companies and politicians, press and the media, police, etc. And that's really important to get a sense of that understanding, because that's really the context of the film. It's trying to say that because the mafia has so much power, they only have that power because they pay off the police, and they pay off judges, and they pay off congressmen to get what it is that they want. But the film has also a kind of melodramatic sensibility to it that's sympathetic to the lead character, Don Vito Corleone, and what he's forced to do and what he doesn't want to do, and how he's trying to make his children's lives legitimate rather than being seen as gangsters, and how that tension within the family is quite sympathetic. In terms of the text of the film, the textual strength of the film, the key thing is its cinematography. The cinematography is extremely dark, particularly for a mainstream film that did so well. The overall look, the tenor, the color palette is really dark. It's a color film, but it's quite dark. Many of the conversations that the lead character, Don Vito Corleone, has are in shadow, and they're beautifully done. And the cinematographer's name was Gordon Willis, who worked very closely with Coppola and other directors like Woody Allen throughout his career. Now, why would the cinematography be dark? Well, because the business they're doing is dark, shadowy, criminal business on the down low, on the QT, and the film speaks of its darkness, shows its darkness very well, and it coheres to the idea of dark themes. Okay. The film's the musical score is a bit melodramatic but effective because it really feels authentically Italian American. Francis Ford Coppola is Italian American, and he gives the film a lot of juicy, authentic details that are Italian American in sensibility. In fact, his father helped with some of the music in the film. His father was a conductor, and the musical score is done by Nino Rota, who's also Italian. And the film has some Italian actors, some who are not Italian, but Al Pacino, this is his coming out film. You won't believe how young he is in the film. And he's Italian American and from New York. And this is not his first film, but his first big film. He became a star after this. The film also, it has a lot of quiet times, and it has a lot of violence and action times and sexual themes. So it has all the bells and whistles that we like to go see movies with, right? It has all the kind of um, there's some humor in the film. There's sexual stuff in the film. There's lots of violence in the film. There's murders in the film. All that kind of juicy kind of material. But at the same time, the film is trying to say something about the institutions of American life. And that's a pretty hard thing to pull off well, to have kind of sloppy, dopey, sexy, violent stuff, yet also make the audience in 1972 think about just how the institutions of American life, like the congressmen and police and judges and the media, are so easily paid off. And that's what the film is trying to get at in 1972, at the same time that audiences have been readied and wonder, and the difficulties of the Vietnam War, and the difficulties of civil rights movement and burgeoning gay rights movement, civil rights movement and burgeoning gay rights movement and feminist movement, and a time of a sea change in American life. The Godfather is an old-fashioned film in one sense, but it really is very modern and progressive in another sense, right? It's saying that capitalism in some senses is corruptible, is easily corruptible. And it's a long way of saying it's all about the money. I have some other things in the reading that's in my chicken scratch here. This says mise en scène, quite dark. And then I also have something called juxtaposition between the sacred and the profane. Okay. What that means is a juxtaposition between the sacred and the profane is there's a wonderful sequence toward the end of the film where Coppola is showing the so-called sacred, that is to say, something that's quite holy, and in the Catholic Church, it has to do with the baptism, and the profane has to do cut to images that are very profane that have to do with the idea of profanity, or the way in which the real world is working. So I think that if you look carefully toward the end of the film, you'll see a wonderfully edited sequence that juxtaposes or cross-cuts between something that is sacred and beautiful and moral and what is underneath that hypocrisy, with cuts to something that is filled with profanity and, horror, let's just say. And Coppola is showing that right toward the end of the film in a beautiful sequence in terms of his ability to demonstrate his editing strength. And the film's long, but it goes by quickly because it's really paced very, very well. Okay? So in terms of text and context, the context, again, anti-authority, anti-establishment, but really this idea of bringing to bear the notion of institutional corruption, not just guys killing other people on the corner to sell drugs. Also, remember that it's made in 1972, even though it's about 1945, 1950, but it's speaking from the point of view of the 1960s, early 70s. It's speaking from that 60s sensibility we've been talking all semester. Okay, and it's also a film that's trying to get at this notion of the family. Okay, that the family is a very, very important idea, but it's not just the family, it's the extended family of America itself. It's not just the Corleones, but the Corleones in a sense represent America, particularly Michael and what he has to do for his father. Okay. As I said before, all the films are available on Amazon Prime. Now, I can't make you pay for them. If you have to pay the 3 or 4, please do. But you have to, if you guys gotta let me know you're seeing these. You have to let me know that shoot me an email if you haven't already, saying, yeah, I'm getting your emails. I'm watching the video lectures. Okay. And also just a gentle reminder that the Godfather week, and then next week, April 7th, is Taxi Driver, Scorsese film. And then in 2 weeks is Review and Exam 2. And what I'll do is I'll just send out an exam through email, and then you answer that in a set period, I don't know, 48 hours or something like that. And then I just email you back with the answer, with corrections and grades, okay? Also, just a word, Please stay safe. Just if you have any hand sanitizer, leave it some in your car. If you have to go to a store, if you have to go to the post office, if you, I mean, I really wouldn't hang around with people. I really wouldn't. I mean, you have to stay home. I mean, this is serious. Norwalk's getting a lot more cases just this past month. Have it linked over from your personal email. I think you can do that in Outlook or on Banner or something. Okay. Um, that's it for 257 for today, and we will. I will see you probably this time next week. But please email me if you have any questions.